Welcome to our Together Tech Roundtable, where we tell you what our projects are, who we are, what we've been up to, and what we could use help with. I'll start today. Since I rarely start, I just do the intro. Why did I just say that? I have no idea what I've been up to. We didn't hold solution raising this week. Carrie showed up and Eric didn't until later, and it was actually perfect. Carrie and I was more in a venting mood. We were going to be discussing humor. I was like, anyway, so that is how solution raising went. Solution raising is an hour-long conversation where you generate solutions with 10,000 people and $100,000. My focus right now is on my own existential crisis of how to get the MLM in the world with my limited capacity and like which direction to take it in. And so right now I'm focusing on the product itself and finding people who enjoy the product, want the product, and want to build that out. Because it's easier than either figuring it out for the community or everyone wants in on the business structure, but not necessarily the product. And the community is most of the people that I know are going to be with the same ideal of community that I have, but at the same time, unless it's explicitly stated, there's a lot of gray area of conflict. If you're not saying that we're here for diversity and authenticity, then that can arise. And that is what I've been up to the last week. Is I did do a presentation for the product. I created a new slide and sent it out to Kylie and Carrie and Raymond. And I'm going to be holding our first 6-week course starting not this Tuesday, where I'm going to be with Carrie and possibly Kylie and figure out kind of the pre to the 6 week, because that's part of it is the product itself is like, do you come in having never heard of anything and do the product, or is it people who know what I'm up to and are there to sample the product and help create it? So anyway, that was kind of all over the place, but yeah, that's also who I am, my eccentric crisis. So who would like to go next?
I can go next. So my main project is Conferati. It is a source of information that earns your trust, and it's meant to provide information on science and news. And then the partner project, WikiLection, which does the same thing, provides information that earns your trust for politics. I've been sort of on hold-ish for the last couple of weeks, been waiting for the new version of the prototype to come out. While I've been working on that, I've been working on the sort of specs for the Conferati platform, and in doing so have decided that the overall decision of development or the direction of development should probably change and focus a bit more on it being a platform as opposed to just a typical coded application. So theoretically, we might be able to talk about that today if nothing else comes up, but that would probably get fairly technical, so I'm not sure. That's what I'm up to.
Okay, and I'm Bentley Davis. I got a couple projects I'm working on. One is, I'm going to just say, GullyBot, which is a chatbot that builds mass agreement across the world, in theory, if it works. I haven't done anything on that project. I'm really getting inspired on another project, which is a generic rating and reporting system that allows you to grade everything, which is also a part of Conferati and WikiLection. So yeah, I want to work on building that and putting it in other spheres. I think I mentioned last time, I kind of got a day job, so I'm working part-time on a startup that's also about information processing. So it's mostly creating digital books that also have an interactive component to them. So you're able to get at content, link out to content more conveniently, and we hope it makes it a more a deeper and more valuable experience than just reading the text, and more so than the current book systems that exist today. So we'll see if that works out. I have had some interesting meetings this week about the Canonical Debate Lab, which is very close to GullyBot. We're looking for funding, so we're doing a lot of work on that. I just was in a meeting with the founder of Ysaurus, which is another debate platform. So I was introducing him to the canonical debate group of projects that have to do with argument and debate mapping. And then I met a guy named Duran who has an idea for a project that helps people handle internal conflicts, which then he hopes would allow people to also handle external conflicts better. So lots of things going on, but mostly I'm moving and I'm resetting up my studio. And right now my desk is in arrears and my internet's choppy, so I may drop off. So we'll see how it goes.
All right. Sounds like you had the most, it makes more sense for you to be in the hot seat. You had a need for something. Can you re-explain? I know I might not be able to add to the technical part, but the difference, why you're thinking that a coded app isn't going to work in a platform would be the way to go.
First of all, good job keeping track of the terms. So the coded app is sort of like every page is coded, right? So like so for example, the most recent change for Wiki Election, the existing prototype tracks people, it tracks organizations, and it tracks the role that the people have held at organizations. So very simple. The next layer was meant to track legislation and then how people had voted on legislation. And then there was also that extra layer of what Bentley was talking about, where it was sort of the ability to add things that you could score legislation on, right? Like, is it good for the environment or bad for the environment, good for business, bad for business, that kind of thing. And then based on how somebody voted, it would affect that, the same score for the person that voted. So if you vote for something that's bad for the environment, your score gets worse for the environment. So that was sort of that's where it's at right now. And then the thing that we were working on, and I think a big part of why it was stuck was the scoring, but also just the fact that like the two are tied together, and a lot of the I guess what I would call object level stuff. So an object is like one individual table in the database. So like people or organizations or legislation, those would all be objects. And I mean, the layouts for all those pages will be not the same, but like the same basic principle of you're showing fields from a record. And there are a number of other applications out there that allow you to sort of, create objects and create, extra fields in those tables. And then it's easier to add them to layouts. So it's sort of like a canvas so that you can say, here's your list of fields, here's a blank page, tell us where you want them. And then you can drag out fields. And so that's different. Like that's a lot of how Salesforce works, where they have their own developers that go and develop that platform, and then other people that aren't developers can essentially make things on their platform, right? Can kind of make apps and add objects and fields and say, how they look. And it wouldn't need to be even 1% of what Salesforce does. But the basic idea of like, you can add tables, add fields, add the pages as they would be linked. And then at that point, someone like me could probably go in and just change what would be the metadata, or like data that's not actually data, or I guess you could say data about data. And so that is sort of the back end, where if we had a coder build the platform, and then they might still need to add tables and fields and stuff like that. But once those existed, then I could just go in there and say, okay, this layout should have this field here, this field here, these sections show this. And as the platform builds out, we can start to make those same sort of changes on all of the pages. Plus, the same thing should be used for Conferati and for Wiki Election. It's sort of two sides of the same coin. And there will almost certainly be more apps like Wiki Election, where it's sort of an offshoot of Conferati and accessing the same overall data set, but like with a unique view into it. But with the same overall, like the way to build how the fields appear on the page, where they're ordered, what links to what, all that type of thing. Does that make sense?
A lot of that was over my head, but kind of. So if we put it in Lego terms, you're looking like as the consumer, as the person, the user, When you were talking about building blocks, is that for like different websites and I'm coming to and I don't know how it's built, or as the user, am I configuring that for my page? You know what I mean? Like, is it my Facebook and I get to choose where everything is, or is Facebook its own thing? And then if I come on Facebook, it has it. But if they
Right.
wanted to use that same piece for Twitter, then Twitter
wouldn't be for users, at least not for the, I would say, even far future. Like that's theoretically possible, but that's way down the road. It's more meant to sort of split the quote unquote development responsibilities, where actual programmers would be building the platform, and then somebody like me that's technical but not a programmer can go in there, sort of learn. Okay, here's how to design a page. Right? It might end up being like.
So you're looking to create the Lego blocks.
Yes.
But then people, because you don't know how to make the Lego blocks, but you know how to put the Lego
Lego's
together.
actually a really good example. It's like currently we've been building, a toy. And instead we're saying, no, instead let's build Lego. So that it's just pieces that, in this case, that's where it kind of falls apart, because it's meant for the end user to build something. In this case, it's more the developers build the pieces, they give them to me, I construct something, and then that's what I put out in the world through, Conferati, through Wikelection, etc. And a part of the platform is also to support, like, there being different, for example, domain names like wikelection.com or conferati.com. There would actually be different apps because they're different views into data.
Mm-hmm.
Like Conferati might not have a special section for legislation, whereas of course Wikelection would, and Conferati would show, like, a bunch of corporations and businesses of all sides. But whereas Wikelection would only show like political parties, lobbying groups, things that are direct, like organizations that are directly connected to politics, but still the same overall data set and that same thing powering it.
So I know what Bentley's doing with the rating system is more like I'm going to bring back to Lego, like a Lego construction set, like the instructions,
like,
but it's like you can build anything with it. It's kind of more.
The thing that Bentley's talking about is like one of those really weird Lego pieces, right? That you're like, it's cool. Like, it might be like a special part of a spaceship or something, where like you couldn't build that with just the Lego pieces, and you can reuse it wherever you see a spot for it. But like, it kind of does have a specialized purpose. In this case, it might actually make it a bit easier, because then you can say, okay, here's that thing that does the scoring, and then you can actually say, okay, here's the different settings that you can do. Here's the, where we're actually storing the different scoring values. Here's the different sets of scores. Here's what objects we're saying are the things that get ranked. And then here are the objects that actually get scored. So in the case of Wikelection, you could say the legislation are the things that are actually being like directly scored or ranked. And then the votes would be the things that are, I guess, are actually counted to help affect that in the end. And then in the very end, the politicians are the people that sort of get automatically scored through that system. So we'd obviously want like some better terms to categorize things, but it becomes easier in my mind if you can just say, here's how it connects. You define each of these variables, like where's the score being stored, what are we counting, and where is it actually being calculated. You can specify those three things. You can use it pretty much anywhere across the platform as long as you're following the rules of that.
And so
control.
Is the idea, I think this is how I understand it with Bentley's, it's the equipment we're working out on, it's the something that you can plug and play in different places, anywhere you need that rating system. That's the idea, that it can be more generic, because a lot of people are trying to solve this. Whereas which one of these things is doing it, like the data itself is not repetitive. So if we put in the politicians' information and we know who they vote, if someone else has to have that information, they don't have to, like, his feels like it's the software that's plug and playable, or the thing we're working out on, whereas yours looking at not having to put in that same information every time as well. And so if I use that same widget on my thing, it comes with that information.
Yeah, that's in the fairly soon future. Like that should be fairly soon into the app, where you can sort of query something and say, hey, I want to make, a Chrome extension that if I'm reading news, it looks for names that we know about, and then, shows a side panel. I would definitely like something like that to be possible. Now, how open it is and stuff like that, I'm not sure, but definitely that's how I want it to be used. Even if it's actually Conferati that ends up making the Chrome extension, but I do want there to be some ability for other services to sort of ask for certain pieces of data, even if it's just, hey, who's this person and what's their score in these areas.
Yeah. I have a couple thoughts. Maybe I am fading in and out. I wonder maybe we could go ahead and stop your guys' videos and see if that clears it up
sure.
a bit. Otherwise, I don't know if y'all will be able to hear me either.
Right. Yeah, you're coming through clear
so
now.
Good. I mean, hopefully it's prioritizing income, my outgoing data rather than the incoming. So yeah, I mean, really, what you want is you're asking for a little bit of functionality, kind of like NAC. Not all of NAC, of course, but just that ability to kind of configure the displays and bubble and all that. It's a kind of a no-code solution.
Right.
And
although in this case, I wouldn't be as attached to like the front end, back end, because that gets kind of weird. Being all that nice, right? Like even if the designing of the page is just like kind of code-ish, right? Like if it's some sort of a document, like a JSON file or something, I would go in there and learn the syntax of, and then I can say like, here's the field, here's where it is on the page, that sort of thing.
I think with a little bit of training, you could do that today. With the
totally, yeah,
tech.
yeah. I do that kind of thing at work. Like it's the sort of thing where really basic syntax, and like using field names, stuff like that. I can do that.
Yeah.
And so if we can allow that to be sort of the bottleneck for, I guess, kind of like the actual translation of what's happening in the back end to the actual front end of, here are the objects that this app uses. Here are the fields on the layout. There's probably going to be a bunch of extra in the back end that most people won't care about, but will track just in case. And then, if I want to add a field or take a field off, I can just go edit this certain file. And then I don't have to, ask a developer and do this and go through a whole bunch of stuff and go through testing, because the testing would mostly be at the platform level on, adding fields on, taking fields off, do things work together, that sort of thing.
We'd have to figure out, though, I guess, is that, are you editing? Because if you want those changes to go live, then we need to get what's called a continuous deployment, which is doable. That's all built into GitHub. But then we'd also have to make sure that your changes are merged into the developer, the test version that Radek or I would be working on, which is doable.
Right. I mean, I guess the goal is for the thing that Radek and possibly you would be working on would be the platform that would translate whatever these files are. Right. So like those will be the things that would actually be in GitHub, and then sort of their job, like the job of the platform, is to take a look at what objects are available, take a look at sort of what app they're at. Right. Are they at Wikilextion or Conferati or something else? And then each of those would end up having its own sort of set of files or set of settings that they would say, okay, they're at Wikilextion, so we're going to go over to this grouping of settings and say things, right? Like here are the top level objects, right? Like there's home, there's people, there's organizations, there's elections, legislation, stuff like that. And
so
then if you click,
it'll all be a balance between, because I mean, some of that is extremely complex and would take a long time to develop, and I don't think that you want that it would be worth the time to build that.
Right.
When really you're still, I mean, I guess, are you thinking that this is still a prototype, or is it a beta software? You want beta because you want users to end up using it. Or it's a combination between, because really
it could be either. At this point, I guess I want to shift, because I think that the platform is sort of a better long-term approach. And so, but I think it's also, if we can get the bare bones part working and put a bit more of the onus on me, then I can do part of the development myself, right?
Yeah, but unless it takes us longer to build a platform than it would for us to build your vision.
But
right, which is what I think it's going to be.
Yeah.
And also, you don't need a platform after you get a certain level of functionality, right?
Well, that's where it's a bit iffy, because there's probably going to end up being a bunch of different portals sort of into the Conferati ecosystem, right? Like like for right now, Conferati is kind of the name for both the platform, and they're going to end up being this busy, probably mess of an app that's doing 100 different things. And so I would expect that WikiLection is going to be a lot cleaner because it's kind of got more specific purpose. And over time, I kind of expect certain things to start splitting off of Conferati, right? Like if the science review part gets big and there's a lot of pieces and it makes sense to give it its own portal, I imagine that will end up happening at some point.
So my understanding from what Radic was working on is that he made it to where the data is stored kind of abstractly, but he hadn't gone in and changed the UI to where it displays that. So his goal was actually to get to what you want to do for the rating system, which is also what I need, because remember, I'm making a generic rating system. So the users need to be able to go in and say, I want to create a legislature, a legislative person, and then I want to, these are the judge, these are the categories, the attributes that I want to rate. So that was all part of the plan. So what I believe he had done back when he showed us the demo was the back end was flexible like that, but the front end was all hard coded.
Right.
So my understanding is he was making that front end more flexible. Now the thing is, though, is that that's only for the rating system part to build, which is kind of a very specific scope. So building a dynamic interface for that is reasonable. Some of the other pages, though, I don't know. We'd have to look at it. I mean, definitely, I think we need to talk it through and figure out where we can do it. I do want to caution, though, that there will be. It sounds like, I don't know that there will be. It sounds like there's a couple of sections and pieces that the workload to make those dynamic might be more than is worthwhile.
Right.
But we definitely have that discussion. But then also, I'm thinking, it sounds like much of WikiElection and Conferati is just an implementation of the generic rating system, which is fine.
I mean, that's definitely an important layer of it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So what? I guess I don't know what. I mean, you'd need that evidence-based. It might be nice to list out your feature set and say which features is the rating system and which features aren't, just so we have an idea of, because your code is still going to be closed source, but my hope is that the rating system would be open source.
Right.
So even though it wouldn't have the data that says here's the representative and all the stuff, or even the structure of a representative has these attributes, that would never be open sourced. But the code that lets you represent that would be. It might be good if we drew some boxes around what's the rating system and what's not. And then, yeah. So do you have a feature list yet?
Yep. It's going to spread apart different things, and it's in there. Oh, it's like, where is this one?
So it might be nice if we consolidated that and some sort of table form, and then said which one of those features are going to be fulfilled in the rating system, and then also get a prioritization from you on it, which I think the rating system is still the top priority.
Right. I guess I don't really have a spreadsheet of those, because I'm looking through the materials that I have for Conferati and for WikiElection, and it sort of talks about how some of the features would be used, but it doesn't call them out into a list.
Yeah. So that'd be nice if you could put that together, and then we could schedule a meeting. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I've been going through and sort of drawing up some of the really basic requirements for the platform. And to your point, maybe it ends up being a weird hybrid platform where it really doesn't need to be a very polished backend. If it's just me editing text files, that's fine. And if I have to check stuff into GitHub, I can learn how to do that, I'm sure. At this point, it's more just about trying to simplify the process of adding a new object and then a new page for it. That shouldn't be a weeks long thing. That should be an hour max. be like, after the table's already been added and we know the fields and we know the layout, that should be, okay, here's the layout for legislation. These fields go here. Okay, and then here's another section where we're going to be listing the votes, and here are the columns to use. Okay, now go render that.
Yeah, and so I think as far as it's within the rating system thing, that'll definitely be doable. Another thing we might consider is to use a content management system for the homepage and the description pages and the blog. I don't know if you have a blog on there, but you probably need one for content marketing.
Yeah, I mean, there will end up being a setup for it. Yeah, and that's where like each individual table kind of or the records need the ability to have some amount of rich text. And so depending, I mean, it could end up being like some objects might just be a single table that are just the rich text.
Right. But I'm distinguishing between your kind of the data and then your more like blog-ish description marketing content.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think that we need to build a content management system into
no. And that's where and I think this is probably true for both Conferati and WikiElection, where there's going to be a website for it, right, which is going to be on some form of a CMS, and there might be blogs and and links out to YouTube and all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then there will be the actual app, right, where it's probably like app.conferati.com or app.wikielection.com, which is where the prototype is. That's how you actually access the application, but then for the media, the blogs, the press releases, that sort of thing, that goes on the website.
So I generally try and keep those on the same domain. There are ways to separate out the
right. Yeah, that's what I was saying.
App dot. I'm saying even the same subdomain.
Oh, okay.
And the reason for that is that Google sometimes you get the same juice or not Google juice, the same SEO if they're separate. Google in some instances has them if they're separate subdomains.
I'm not too worried about SEO. I mean, I don't think
do you ever want people to use the system?
Well, at a certain point, it will become if it actually gains traction, it'll become something like Wikipedia or IMDb, where Google actually says, okay, give this more credence, right? If somebody's searching for an actor, go ahead and use IMDb, right?
Well,
and they have special sort of parsers for it and stuff. But I'm not really sure what somebody would search for to end up on the site, except for someone's name.
Well, yeah, they'd search for a politician's name.
Yeah.
But your reputation based on your blog posts, you want that to apply to whether Google recommends you also for the politicians themselves.
Yeah, but
you don't want to have two separate reputations and then they're not combined. So they're each half as likely to be shown up on Google.
Because a lot of the major B2B apps do it that way, right? Like that's how Salesforce does it.
But that's and they're taking a hit on their SEO.
Yeah, and they don't.
Or they're likely to.
And they're never indexing the app part, because that's all behind, very
well. So that's the question. Well, right. But see, your data, I think you do want to index.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah. If it's public, then it should be indexed. Some of these stuff might be member only, and then that wouldn't be.
We also have to. Yeah, and there's a lot of technical issues to make sure that it's indexable.
Yeah.
I mean, the good news is Google's pretty good at indexing JavaScript dynamic applications these days, but I don't trust them. So I also statically generate the data that Google's indexed.
And for the most part, I expect that as it starts being used, it would start using sort of the original Google thing, the backlinking, right? Where people in Twitter posts and on Facebook and on their websites and stuff would be like, hey, check out this profile, for Donald Trump, and then link that to the WikiElection page. You do that, 10,000 times, and all of a sudden Google's like, wait, what? That's what I expect will actually end up being the thing.
So I think we do need to have you choose a content management system to use outside of the application, and then we also need to and maybe even get that up and running so that you can do that stuff. Because you don't have anything like that right now, right? A WordPress website or anything?
I mean, the website for Wikilection, I think, is Wix. And so really, like, I still sort of thinking that it's going to end up being two different subdomains, at least to start with. If the platform ends up, having some sort of integrated CMS where, like, I can have a page that is proper CMS, and there's a decent way to sort of show that, where it's like, hey, here's the web page and all the content that I want to show there, and a decent way to say, on the flip side, here's all the content that you might actually be here for.
Right.
I would be
regardless of whether they're on the same subdomain or not doesn't matter. So if you get it'd be a headless content management system. So you would go to a completely different page, enter the data, and then we could serve it up on any domain anywhere.
I see. Okay.
So we just need to.
I haven't played with headless.
It might be
CMSs before.
Yeah, so we might choose one. I'm trying to think of the one that I
don't think we need to worry about that now, because I think for now I'm going to keep them separate, where the www will be the website, and then the app will be the app. If the app,
so you're saying,
and
when
the
you say keep
platform
them separate, you're saying that you're happy using Wix as your CMS,
or whichever, right? At that point, they're completely divorced. So if I wanted to use Wix or Drupal or the big one whose name I'm forgetting, it's not coming to me. But yeah, WordPress. There we go. If it's any of those, right? Because right now I just had to change the subdomain mapping for app.wikilection.com for the prototype, and then triple W I changed through Wix, right? Like those are two totally separate things. If I want to now change who the web hosting is, like for the website, I can do that at will and not affect the application.
Okay. So I think the main thing we need to do is get a list of features in prioritized order for desirability. Although we of course may move the order depending upon the speed of development, right? Because if something's an easy, quick win and it provides value, we can move it up in priority. But if we just had it in priority order,
right? I can probably do like the 1 to 10 priority, and then work with you and Radek to get a 1 to 10 on difficulty, and then we can make that chart showing, hey.
Yeah.
And then there will be some things that are core. You're like, hey, even if this is easy, if we can't use it until that thing is done, then there's no point in making it until that.
Right, yeah. And then also to have a flag on there, or an indicator whether they are part of the generic rating app or if it's unique to Wikilection.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I think the rating app, it would end up being built into, like, its native place is this app, and then we can. I mean, I'm not sure how early we want to branch it. Like, if we want to get it working and see, like, oh, okay, this is now able to score, legislation and people and this, and here's how it's mapping here.
I would
great. Now let's transplant that to open source world. And then you've got something.
I got some stuff I'd like to start using it for in a couple of weeks.
Right.
So either I'm gonna rewrite it from scratch.
Whichever. I mean, for my purpose, as long as my version works, go nuts.
That's what I'm thinking. So I just need to talk to Radek
at the point where, like, I'm hoping it can be reused, but also if the whole thing, like, it's been frozen for way too long now. I'm sort of like, hey, if it's not done, in the next, let's say 5 hours, just don't worry about it.
Right.
We'll just be starting from scratch.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is I don't want to. It's a balance between, I definitely don't want to slow Radek down, or if I help on the Wikilection side, don't want to slow that development down at all. So it may just be, I look at Radek's code and write something that's compatible, and then at some point we could integrate it back in and use it or whatever. It's really kind of having that discussion, but I think it would be helpful also to know kind of like what percentage of Wikilection is this rating app, because in my mind it's like 75%, but I've probably forgotten some features that you want,
depends, because it's definitely one of the major things, but without the evidence system, it's kind of useless because it's just numbers. You're like, great, you say there's 6. Well, why should I believe you?
Right.
And that's where like it's going to end up being very integrated with that, right? We're at the underlying level, the content dissection and the rating system will be really intertwined because you're going to be like, this content is saying this, but then it's proven untrue, but then it's kind of this, and then it's it's going to be interesting to figure out what the end score ends up being after the content is.
Now, I also envision the rating system does have some evidence pieces in it because it's basically underneath that. I think I'm going to have reason score. But the piece that I don't think it needs is like you had a rather high value advanced kind of video thing, and that'd be the level of detail that this other system wouldn't need. So that I think would be kind of a unique feature. But the fact of saying, okay, I put this rating and here's a link to the evidence, that's something I think we'll also need in there. And then that evidence could be rated using reason score, pros and cons, and debated.
Right. Because so another thing that I'm considering, which might affect, like, if you think that doing the full platform is a good idea or not, is drawing up a lot more detailed specs and then using Upwork, and hiring some people in India or somewhere to sort of build the platform. Because then, if it takes, 100 hours or 200 hours, like that's a lot more manageable. And then in the end, I would hope that there's some rudimentary documentation, so either they or somebody else can pick it up. But with the end goal being that, adding new pages, adding new objects, doing stuff like that, even if it's a bit more complex than that is in my day job, would still be faster in the long run, I think.
Now, I do probably have some time for some paid work. The problem is that I charge 2 to 3 times, even at my lowest rates, for a product that I believe helps the world, which, of course, WikiLection falls into that category. I still cost at least 2 times more than I think you could hire a pretty decent dev, not the lowest price dev, and I'm 3 times more than kind of the average price, and probably 4 times more than the cheapest dev, which I think are more work than they're worth.
No,
but I also might be twice as fast or 4 times as fast. I had charged fewer hours just because I know what we're doing and everything.
Right.
So we might want to think about whether I am a efficient use of funds, and maybe just having me manage those resources from a technical standpoint.
That's kind of what I was planning. It is easy, having somebody that I know and trust sort of help. Both help manage them and help answer questions that I wouldn't be able to, right? And then, like, I can talk to either you or Radek or whoever, sort of have that back and forth, right? Like, sort of product manager architect type relationship in the software world.
Yeah, so we probably need to have a separate meeting, and probably that one where we talk about budgeting and what you feel like you can afford to invest. Although I still kind of feel bad about that because I'm not going to suggest spending any money unless I can see that you will get it back.
Right. And that might be a part of it, right? Is I can come up sort of with the documentation for what I think the first version should be. And it's probably more realistic to start saying beta. If it ends up being a prototype, that's fine. Yeah. But kind of for it to, even if it starts off as a prototype that hopefully evolves into a beta, but like, I really don't expect all of this to, in 2 or 3 years, if it's solid and stable and has a big user base, I don't expect there to be a lot of correlation between the two projects. If there is, great. If not, that's fine too. Really, it's just meant to sort of, prove the concept, and hopefully I'll help be somewhat agile to prove new concepts. But then to help show people, hey, here's what you'd be buying into if you supported us on Patreon or wherever.
Yeah, and is that your kind of initial funding model is Patreon? something similar?
Patreon or Kickstarter or something like that, right? Like
Oh,
it's really well, the initial funding is me, and then after that it goes into crowdfunding, and that's the goal is to where most of the money should come from.
Okay.
I
So
won't
even
do investors.
So even a prototype you could start promoting and seeing if it
I guess the basic goal is I pay for a prototype that sort of gets people interested, and then that gets people interested to start paying into the organization, and then the organization pays to build it properly.
Okay. Well, yeah, then yeah, let's get with Reddit, get your feature list, and let's talk about how we can facilitate that in the quickest way possible, including, like you said, making it to where you can contribute time to the project more efficiently.
Totally, yeah. And that it's a bit easier to sort of add new pages and things that I'm used to doing, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the
and
whole,
And I think what Radic, as far as the rating system, like we said, and that's kind of probably the base. I think Radic is already working on making it to where you can add an entity and it'll create a page for it automatically. I think that's what he's been working on. So he may be partially down that path, and maybe now that we know that if I'm an efficient use of financial resources, then I can hop in and maybe we can get this thing moving faster.
Right. Now, do you remember what Radic is using for the back end? Because I think for the front end,
it's Firebase, and I think the front end's React.
Okay.
And I've that's my most recent technology stack.
Okay, cool. So now, do you know? Because I've been doing a bit more research just on the stacks. Everything I read was saying like, hey, for prototypes, Ruby on Rails keeps coming up.
No.
So what is the difference, like, as far as like
Ruby on Rails is the exact wrong thing to use.
With the gems? I mean, that part sounds interesting, but I don't know what Firebase is and sort of what libraries it has. But like I did a bit of research into what sort of gems are available for Ruby on Rails, and there were some very good sounding ones, right, that might make future parts of the prototype.
The problem, well, I don't know, when they say Ruby on Rails, are they saying Ruby on Rails and then having a React or some sort of front end, or are they talking about Ruby on Rails and just Ruby on Rails?
So when all the reading I did was talking about using Ruby on Rails purely as the backend, and then I'll in a separate conversation, because at first I did some research on, hey, what's the difference between Ruby on Rails and React, and the general consensus of a bunch of things I read was
so
they're not comparable. That Ruby on Rails was the backend and React was the front end.
Ruby on
that's my understanding.
Ruby on Rails used to be, when it was first created, generates the front end HTML and CSS and sends it to the server. So it was a completely back-end system and had no dynamic on the front end. And then you had to have a different technology. So I guess now recently they've said now just use it as a back-end. But your system doesn't have a lot of back-end code. And so what Firebase is it's a fully built back end. It's a no-code back end, basically.
Right.
So I don't know why, unless you have some high-level processing on the back end, which I don't think you do. So the modern process would be to go basically what's serverless functions is the more thing, rather than using C# or Ruby on Rails to have a back-end server that you'd have to scale.
Right.
So now all you do is you have a database that you're allowed that has an automated. So the Ruby on Rails is basically building an API to your database, and it's very fast for that. But the Firebase database is an API.
Right.
So we don't need, it's an extra step to put Ruby on Rails in there.
Yeah, that was the universal thing that was sort of the con against Ruby on Rails was the performance. That was like really the only thing that they listed was like, the performance compared to the other options, it isn't as good. Now the part that I'm not sure about is like for something like Firebase, right? If you wanted to add, like, is there, just a really easy sort of, I mean, I don't think that even Ruby on Rails, the term plug and play still doesn't apply, but I'll use it because I don't know what else to use.
What gems did you hear of that you thought might be useful?
1 second, I've got
Think
that
of
link
any?
somewhere. Okay, 1 second.
Because there might be some pieces of functionality.
Right. So I mean, they had a bunch of things that they were talking about, like sort of data display. They had a bunch like for pagination, for categorization, for easy cloning records, soft delete. Like they have a full list of, here's things for internationalization. There's some good testing stuff. I mean, coders might be interested in some of the stuff where they're talking about coding style and debugging. But one of the main things is looking at things like the member sort of creation management backend. At some point, there are a few features that will rely on either accepting payments or recurring payments, and there's like a bunch of sort of like payment backends where I'm quite used to working, in the payment cards industry, with billing, not at like the most detailed, actually talking to the gateways, but like if there's a tool that we, it just says, hey, you need, a gateway in these countries, you need this information, and then just plug that information into the gem and you can start card processing. That would be awesome, right? If it were 50 hours instead of 500 hours.
Yeah, I guess my concern is that all of those payment processing backends have their own JavaScript APIs. And if the Ruby on Rails gems is just a backend and not a front end, then...
Right, yeah, and that's, I guess, one of the key things is like, and this is probably something that I guess like somebody who works in Ruby on Rails currently would have more information on, but the articles I was reading, they were sort of talking about using Ruby on Rails as the backend, and a lot of people talked about using React as the front end for a Ruby on Rails backend.
Yeah, but I think those gems are probably both front end, back end Ruby Rails, because it wouldn't be
Possibly.
much value in. And are you looking at the dates of these articles?
This one
you might want to do that, because if they're over 2 years old or over a year old,
this one was from January 2020.
All right, why don't you gather up a few of those and shoot them my way or document them on that spreadsheet, and then we can take a look at them, because I didn't even know that people were starting to use Ruby on Rails as just a backend. But honestly, I mean, I don't see why you do the extra work when Firebase has a backend, builds a backend for you automatically when you build the database. So
yeah, actually, that's a good one. Second, let me go here to Firebase. I'm going to do some research, just seeing how people are currently talking about Firebase compared to Ruby on Rails, and sort of seeing what they're saying the differences are. Sorry, I remember saying feature list. That's going to end up being a weird mess because there's going to be like things on the platform side and the front end and features and that. But that's fine. This and then a list of Ruby on Rails gems, etc. So those are the things I'll work on. So kind of personally, I'm going to go do some research on the Firebase versus Rails just to see what people are saying. But then for our future conversation, I'll actually list out the features in just like a spreadsheet, and do some of the basic like sort of how important they are, what I figure the dependencies are, that sort of thing. And then I'll go and make a list of the things that came up in my Ruby on Rails research that sound interesting, especially as far as existing gems are concerned. That if Firebase or something else has an alternative, I don't care about Ruby versus not. I just want like a fast, good prototype. That's all I care about.
Yeah, so Ruby on Rails definitely was the most popular prototyping tool 3 years ago.
Right.
But that was before you have things like where you have these dynamic backends. So I like in the first article I'm hitting, they say Firebase might be less time consuming.
Right.
And then they say Ruby is simpler. And Ruby has a better community, but it's not. Ruby is no longer faster to develop in. Okay.
Do you know? I'm wondering if that takes into account the size of the prototype. Like, is there, because with all of the gems, if Firebase doesn't have that, I wonder if it's sort of a rudimentary prototype is faster in Firebase, but once you hit a certain point, maybe it starts to be faster in Ruby. If you're going to be, using like 10 gems, they're like, yeah, at that point, it's probably worth it. If if you aren't using any gems or one or two, it might end up being faster just to use Firebase and then do the functions of those one or two gems. But if you're going to be using 10 or 20, okay, now we're in the territory of, yeah, that probably is. You're going to be saving a ton of time there.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. But like when you talk about members, the Firebase has a full member system built into it.
Right.
So I guess we'd have to look to see if those pieces aren't already built. Most stuff like that, you could get a JavaScript. Like they already have an API to those things. So we'd have to. So yeah, if you get a list of the gems, I mean that definitely would be something to be like, oh, if we use this gem, we don't have to write this whole section of the app.
Right. Totally. Yeah. If we can figure out what those situations are, and I guess that's probably what it will end up coming down to is like not just here are the gems that sound interesting, but like here are the gems that actively sound like they probably should be used.
Yeah.
And then some like. I guess that's where it gets a bit tricky with it. Is it sounds like some of the gems I wouldn't necessarily care about, but like you or another developer taking a look at it might say like, oh yeah, that would be quite useful. Because if this it is meant to be a somewhat long-term prototype, doing like some really basic automated testing wouldn't hurt. Like it's just to cut the testing loads in half.
I can't imagine that they would have a gem that would have better testing than what we have.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because we're just writing JavaScript, and there's like 50 different JavaScript automated testing tools. I don't know. Cool. I mean, go if you want to list a few of those, that'd be fine.
Yeah, I might just end up sending you this article first because it sort of has that. Yeah. Actually, yeah. Here, one sec. I'll put this in the chat. Because it's got them split into, I don't know, like 15 or 20 sort of like sections, and then a bunch of gems for each section. And some of them, I don't have any skin in that game, right? Like there's testing, coding style, debugging. Some of them, kind of get into interesting to me, but not directly. But I can see that they're important. Things like authentication, security, deployment, search is in there. Like there's a bunch of things, which, a big part of it is how easy it is to actually implement it, and do we need all of the things that it's going to do? I understand, yeah, there's going to be a lot of back and forth, but I guess a big part of this is just me doing the research on Firebase versus Rails and just seeing what people are saying. Because if Firebase is fine, then then it's probably easier just to stick with it because we're already there.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Part of it is I'm also
there are
okay
two
with
different languages,
right,
so
yeah.
I don't know if Radix would be interested in coding that. So you might have to get a full new set of developers. That's usually actually the biggest decision on what technology to go with is just what do your developers know.
Right.
But we can look, and I can see if there's anything in here. I mean, there also in this article, if there's anything that stuck out to you, like you mentioned the authentication authorization,
I get
admin panel.
I like from my side, the active record thing sounded interesting, partly because I'm also hoping that in using Ruby, because it's sort of meant to be like that really sort of templated, plug and play backend style, that I'm hoping that some of them might either support this natively or can kind of be repurposed to be that platform to sort of say, hey, use this gem, and then I'll feed it these values based on some file, and that now tells us how to render the page for people or for for legislation, that kind of thing.
So yeah, so like Active Record is an ORM, an object relational mapper. So that's if you're hitting a relational database.
Right.
Firebase is a document store database, and one of the reasons that document store databases are good is that you don't need an ORM. So it's one of those things where they created Active Record because we had relational databases, but we're not using relational databases anymore. So you don't. It's a whole category
So
of
what are,
problems that you don't need anymore.
because when I hear relational database, that sounds like what I would have in mind, because a huge part of this is how the records relate to each other. So is the content part, is that all the same
Well,
features
then
as
what
a
you do is you're
relational?
using right, but actually what you're talking about is a graph database, not a relational database,
Okay.
because the objects relate to each other, not the tables.
I'm used to those being the same thing. What's the difference?
Well, so in a table, you say that there's a relationship, there's a one-to-many relationship between, well, actually many, between a legislature from the legislators table and the
Like between
so
the legislation and politicians, there's a many-to-many
right,
relationship in how they
yeah.
voted. Yeah. And so how I've like documented that is there's three tables there. There's people, there's legislation, and then there's a joint table in the middle called, I think, just voting history, that then has a lookup to both of those, right? That whereas it's got a column for the ID of the legislation and a column for the ID of the person, and then it says how they voted and anything else that we need to know about the vote.
So I mean, the same thing is done in this, except it's just two tables, because you have an entity and then you have a table of relationships between the entities. Although you could do that in a relational database as
How does that
well.
work with the tables having different columns, though?
That's the thing, is in a document database, you don't have any object can have any number of columns, and they don't have to relate to the other columns. You don't have to have a defined structure to put data in a collection together.
Okay.
That's the difference between relational and document, is that a document database is much more flexible.
Okay.
The problem
I'm
is
wondering if it ends up being like, is it as good for actually like crunching numbers and doing calculations, and when those relationships between the records in the tables are incredibly important, and there's going to be a lot of back and forth?
Number crunching is okay, but doing a dynamic query among them is a little bit slower in this case. But that doesn't necessarily, but document databases scale a lot better than relational databases. So as it gets bigger, the document database gets more efficient. Well, it's less efficient,
right,
than a relational database.
Is that like talking sort of about having a bunch of different pages, or is that talking about as sort of the database gets more complex? Because this is going to end up being one hell of a database.
No, it's not complexity. It's volume of data.
It's volume of data. Okay.
As the volume of data increases, the relational databases become.
And that's saying both when the number of tables increases and the number of records, it handles both of those better?
Well, in the document database, you don't have multiple tables. I mean, you have fewer tables.
The concept of having more tables, right? Like if we were having it, right, there's realistically there would probably end up being over 100 tables when all is said and done, right? Like if we're looking at just the people, organizations, their roles, there's probably going to end up being some stuff underlaying that for the content. There's going to be legislation, like things are going to be so interrelated. It's just going to be this spider web of a database map if it were a relational database.
It depends. Mostly that's not going to affect either the data the systems, right? Because they're both optimized to handle that. I mean, unless you're talking about thousands of tables, that's only the time it gets to.
I don't think so, right, but
I don't think so.
And plus, especially not super active tables. Like there might end up being, if there were 1,000. Half of them would end up being these weird fringe tables that some of them, like if we take into account the metadata tables and stuff like that, maybe, but yeah.
So you would, but then you'd restructure how you design the databases. You go up an abstraction layer. So, one of the main differences is that document databases are much faster to do an initial development in than a relational database.
Right.
Because for a relational database, I have to decide what each column has, and I have to decide what its value is. In a document database, I can take any document any JavaScript string, and I can just throw it in the database.
Okay.
So it cuts the development time significantly.
Right.
And then it scales faster. But the problem is that if you're running a query that says dynamic calculations, like I want to write a query that says for all these people that have the name begin with M and have a legislation that has a rating of 5, that sort of thing is faster in relational databases.
Right.
But what you do for that when you do document databases is you pre-compute that on the back end. So if your queries aren't as dynamic, the document database is better.
I mean, that part is good because that I do expect a lot of those kinds of searches, but they should mostly be sort of built into the apps, right? Like, for example, when you're looking at a list of organizations in WikiElection, it's going to be a filtered list showing organizations involved in politics.
Yeah.
And so there can be some sort of a flag there, and then it's easy to say, go pull that list, and then, it's already pre-calculated.
Yeah. And then there are ways to optimize around that if you end up needing that. So, yeah.
Okay, cool. That's good. I think we're...
But we can talk a little bit more about it. But yeah,
perfect.
I'll take a look at
thank you for this.
stuff.
I've got a bunch of notes here of stuff to research. This was very helpful.
We'll schedule a meeting with me and Radek sometime.
Sure, yeah, for sure.
All right, guys. I think we noticed we are at 10 o'clock. I forgot to mention yesterday in our meeting that I may not be at next week's board meeting.
Okay.
Depends. I just have to go pick up my dad from a surgery, so depends what time that is at.
Okay.
And, other than that, I will maybe see you next week, and I will be at this next week either way.
Okay.
And we can say goodbye to YouTube. It's weirder with the cameras off.
Yeah.